Got something to say? Get in on the conversation at 415-915-2291. That's 415-915-CALL-1.
Welcome to Conspiracies Against Wellness with your host, Janelle Elgaway.
Good evening. Welcome to Conspiracies Against Wellness. I'm your host, Janelle Elgaway. If you have a question for our guest, call in at 415-915-2291 or call 1. Call Nation, I am literally in geek mode and so excited because of our guest tonight. Dr. Don Easterbrook is here with us this evening to talk about his life's work on climate change and thoughts on global warming and more. The definition of climate change is a change in global or regional weather patterns, in particular, a change apparent from the mid to late 20th century onwards, and widely thought of as to being attributed largely to the increased levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide produced by fossil fuels. What does this really mean? Are we being told the truth by our government and major institutions such as NASA and NOAA? Let's get into this, and without further ado, welcome Dr. Don Easterbrook. How are you this evening?
Hi, I'm just fine, thank you. Happy to chat with you.
Same here. So can you please tell me a little bit about who you are and what your background is in?
Sure. I have a bachelor's degree, master's degree, and PhD in geology from the University of Washington, and I taught at Western Washington University on the faculty for about 40 years. And during that time, I conducted research on global climate change in various parts of the world, Western North America, New Zealand, Argentina, various other parts of the world. I've written about a dozen books, 185 professional papers in professional journals. I presented 30 research papers at international meetings in 12 countries. So that's what I've been doing. My research activities are primarily related to climate change, coming from the standpoint of the study of changes in glaciers, which make very nice paleothermometers. They tell us when the climate is warm because they retreat. They tell us when it's cold because they advance. And I do a lot of work with temperature changes using isotope data from ice cores that allow us to tell what the temperature is, and looking at gases that are trapped in air bubbles to tell us what the carbon dioxide level is at given time. And so my approach is essentially that the past is the key to the present and also the key to the future, because we can learn a lot from what the climate has done. Climate is always changing, and so a lot of my studies have been studying the changes in climate over tens of thousands of years. So that's essentially where I'm coming from.
Okay. So why is there warming and cooling on this Earth, and why and how does this occur?
There are lots of different kinds of warming and cooling on Earth. For example, there's day-to-day changes in the weather. Everybody's familiar with that. If you don't like the weather now, wait till tomorrow, it'll probably be something different. And those changes also occur over longer time periods. So there's a fundamental difference between weather and climate. Weather is a short-term change, like in a season or a few years, something like that. Climate is a longer-term change that may involve time periods of 30 years or more, or centuries even, that sort of thing.
Okay.
So there's a big difference in how the Earth responds to the sun's rays warms the ocean, cools the oceans. So there's a strong interaction between the sun and the oceans, which is responsible for a lot of the climate changes that we observe. And of course, the day-to-day changes, the short-term changes, the weather changes are caused by changes that occur in the atmosphere.
Well, and we hear a lot about that this was like the hottest year on record. What was actually the hottest year in our century?
The hottest year of record is 1936, although you won't hear that very much. What happened was that during the past century, there were periods of warming and cooling. The climate hasn't always been the same, despite what you hear from various people in the news media who claim it's always been the same until CO2 went up. That's just not true. Climate's always changing. And so the changes that have occurred have been, well, they are sporadic. They follow certain patterns, but there's a lot of variability. And it's by looking at what has happened to various aspects of the sun-ocean relationship that we can determine what is really going on.
So, okay, so how, we hear that CO2 is causing global warming. Is this true?
No.
Okay.
It's not. And let me tell you why. It is true that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. That means that it will trap certain wavelengths, infrared, which is heat, and thereby cause some warming, very little. And so you could say, well, gosh, if carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, that must be the answer. But we have to take into consideration how much CO2 is in the atmosphere, and there's almost none. It's so small; it's very, very tiny. It makes up only 41,000ths of 1% of the atmosphere, which is about as close to nothing as you can get. For example, if you were to take a bucket of air out of the room where you are now, in every 100,000 molecules of air, you would have 78,000 nitrogen, 21,000 oxygen, but only 30 of carbon dioxide.
Wow.
There's so little of it. Wow. So it's kind of like saying, gee, if you spit in the ocean, will that raise sea level? And the answer is, well, yes, it will, but it's so small that it's inconsequential. And the same is true with carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide in the air makes up such a small proportion of the air that there's not enough of it to really have a very pronounced effect. So you can produce only something like 1/10 of a degree of climate change by increasing carbon dioxide. And for most of the last 90,000 years or so, the composition of CO2 in the atmosphere has been at least 4 to 5 times what it is right now, with no bad effects. Life flourished on Earth during times of far higher CO2. So how do we know then that CO2 is not causing significant climate change? And what we can do is we can go back into the past and look at ice cores, for example, and the gas bubbles that are in the ice cores contain carbon dioxide. We can measure the amount, we can measure the time by counting the layers of ice, and we can determine the temperature by looking at oxygen isotope ratios. And what we find is that when we plot the temperatures for, say, the last 100,000 years, the last 200,000 years, something like that, that we can determine by measuring the ratio of oxygen isotopes. That tells us what the temperature of the snow was that fell before it was turned into ice. And we draw a curve, and then we measure the amount of carbon dioxide that's in some of these air bubbles. We find that carbon dioxide always lags temperature increases, say, after an ice age when it's warming up. In other words, if carbon dioxide were to cause global warming, then the carbon dioxide should go up, and then the warming should follow. And what we find is just the opposite. The temperature goes up, and then the carbon dioxide goes up. And the reason for that is as the temperature goes up, it warms the ocean, and that releases more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It's kind of like warming a bottle of champagne. Pretty soon the carbon dioxide comes bubbling out of it. So we know that on a long-term basis that CO2 always lags, always follows increases in temperature, never occurs before it, as it would have to. In addition, there are some modern-day examples that the temperature changes that occurred, that have been ascribed to CO2, occurred after 1950s. That's when a lot of carbon dioxide was put into the atmosphere. And the more carbon dioxide you put in the atmosphere, if it's causing warming, should cause the temperature to get warmer. So what we find, in fact, is just the opposite. After the CO2 started to soar in the atmosphere by human emissions, after 1950, then the carbon dioxide should have caused warming, but in fact we had 30 years of global cooling, all the while that the carbon dioxide was rising at a very rapid rate because of greatly increased human emissions. And then if we look at the period between about 1915 and about 1945, which was a warm period, actually a little bit warmer than what we've experienced since about 1980, and that period was actually a bit warmer than what we've experienced with a higher CO2, only there was no CO2 then. And then if we go back farther in time, if we go back the last 500 years, there were 40 periods of time when the temperature went from cool to warm to cool to warm, long before any increase in human emissions that raised CO2 in the atmosphere. So all of these things point to the idea that the CO2 is not really causing any significant increase in global temperatures.
So why are top scientists and institutions focusing on CO2 so much and making that the culprit of whatever's going on?
The science is very clear, and the data is very clear. But political motives have crept into the whole idea of climate change. And you can get an idea of the political impact of what's going on in the world by looking at what the United Nations is doing. And if you may remember, a few years ago, there was a big meeting in Copenhagen, and what came out of that was a document called Agenda 21. Mm-hmm. And you can look this up on the internet for yourself, and you can see what it says exactly. And essentially what it said was that this was a way that is climate change was a way, a vehicle, so to speak, by which the global government could be changed from individual nations to a single government in the United Nations for the whole world. And that government was to be a socialist government with all kinds of restrictions and things like that. So the short answer to your question is, what's behind it is totally political. And we can talk more about that later if you like. But if you look at the Paris Agreement, it's very similar to what was put out in the Copenhagen Agreement a few years ago as Agenda 21. And it calls for a socialist world government, and that since the climate is supposedly changing, is going to be catastrophic, the only way to prevent catastrophic climate change is by getting rid of democracies, which are not doing a very good job of reducing CO2, and converting to a system where there can be more restrictions and more mandatory things that are done to presumably hold down CO2. So the answer to your question is all political.
All right. I agree with you.
Power and money. There's big money in it, too, because the amount of money spent on things related to climate change are tremendous. We're talking about maybe $1 trillion a year globally, something like that. been estimated that the effect of restrictions of various kinds that are imposed on the basis of climate change costs the U.S. economy something like $1.5 trillion a year, and big money is going to the United Nations. The Copenhagen Agreement, for example, called for the United States to contribute $200 billion a year to the United Nations with no strings attached. They could do whatever they wanted with it, with the idea that this would be distributed to poor countries who are suffering because we put too much CO2 in the atmosphere, and this is sort of paying back some kind of a moral debt. So it's complicated, but it's all about power and money.
Right. Well, and that's actually not that complicated when you look at it that way. We have a question. Does this relate to carbon credits?
Yes. One of the ideas about trying to curb the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, it isn't going to make any difference, but the idea behind it was that in order to reduce the emissions of carbon dioxide by both industries and by individuals, that there would be certain limits imposed, but you could get around those limits if you could buy carbon credits. In other words, if you're putting into the atmosphere more CO2 than you're allowed to, you can pay some money, buy so-called carbon credits to offset the excess that you're using, and then presumably you're not harming the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. So I want to go on a little bit more about, some details on stuff. So how does the sun actually change the Earth's temperature? I know I've read about like sun flares you were talking about and stuff like that. Can you talk in detail a little bit about all that stuff?
Sure. The sun is essentially a huge hydrogen bomb. That's where the energy comes from, and it emits all kinds of things that are transmitted from the sun to the Earth. And there's a lot of radiation. There is heat. The sun obviously heats the Earth. And one of the things that has bothered people for a long time was that if the sun is the source of climate changes, in other words, if when we have a warm climate, the sun is hotter, or if the Earth has a cold climate, the sun is colder, that the sun's output might be changing. Well, physicists have told us for a long time that the amount of energy emitted by the sun to the Earth can be calculated per square meter on the Earth, and it has changed very, very little. It hasn't changed enough to account for the amount of temperature change that we observe on the Earth. And so it was always an enigma of how could the changes in the sun's output be responsible for climate changes if the difference in its output is so small. Well, it turns out that it isn't the amount of, say, solar heat that's coming that's changing. What's happening is that the sun's magnetic field changes. It gets stronger and weaker. When the sun's magnetic field gets weaker, as it's doing right now, actually, then that allows more cosmic radiation to get past this solar shield of magnetism. The magnetic field of the sun shields us from radiation from space. And so if the sun's magnetic field is diminished, then more of that comes to the Earth. When that radiation goes through the atmosphere, it produces what are called ions. These are charged particles in the air, and those charged particles attract water vapor and cause condensation. And that condensation forms clouds. So if you get more clouds, then more of the sun's energy is reflected from the clouds and never reaches the Earth, and the climate gets colder. Well, it turns out there's just an excellent correlation between the sun's magnetic field and climate on the Earth. And that seems to be the connection. It seems to be that the thing that's driving the fluctuations in climate on the Earth appears to be fluctuations in the strength of the sun's magnetic field, which can be measured, and we have a good record of it. The changes in the solar magnetic field are reflected by the number of sunspots. Sunspots are dark areas, little dots that appear on the surface of the sun, discovered by Galileo back in 1609. and they've been tracked since then. And one of the example of how that works is that from about 1650 to about 1700 was a very, very cold period called the Little Ice Age. And terrible things happened. About a third of the population of Europe perished in the crop failures resulting from the very cold climate then. Well, it turns out that during that period, there were virtually no sunspots. And so there's always been a correlation between, the sunspots are telling us how the sun's magnetic field is behaving, and it has a very strong effect. The magnetic field has a very strong effect on whether it's cold or not. So when we have very few sunspots, there's good correlation with cooler climates on the Earth, and just the reverse, much the other way around. We've now just come from a solar high, so to speak, and entered a grand solar minimum, which means that we are, if it follows the same pattern as it has for hundreds and hundreds of years, that we're looking ahead at cooler climates, not warmer climates.
Okay, so we're about to go into a cooling then, basically, or we have been in one.
We have been. We've been. The fluctuation back and forth looks kind of like this. From 1850 to 1880 was a warm period. From 1890 to 1915 was a cool period. 1915 to 1950 was a warm period. 1950 to 1980 was a cool period. 1980 to 2000 was a warm period. And for the past 15 years or so, the climate has been actually cooling. There's been no global warming in the past 20 years.
Wow.
So when people say, "Oh, the Earth is getting hotter and hotter," then you want to ask the question, well, how can there have been no global warming for the past 20 years? And that is documented by 2 satellites and by weather balloons, that there's been no global warming for the past 20 years. So at any rate, it all gets back to what's going on with the sun.
Okay. I have a question about the sun. So just like Earth, are other planets being warmed and cooled in the same way as we are?
Apparently so, although not to the same degree, because the distances from each planet to the sun is so different. We happen to be just in the right place to get the very nice climate. Mercury is a lot hotter because it's a lot closer. The planets that are farther away are a lot colder. There is some suggestion that there is an ice cap that forms on Mars, not from water vapor, maybe from carbon dioxide or something like that, that seems to fluctuate in phase with what's going on with the Earth. But there's very little known about that yet, so it's problematic.
Is there still that? I mean, I remember. I think it was in the 80s. All we heard about was the hole in the atmosphere, and we have to stop using aerosol cans and stuff like that. What's going on with that hole right now? Is it still there?
Well, it's been fluctuating, and that was essentially a hole in the ozone. The ozone protects us from ultraviolet rays coming from the sun. And so if you have a hole in the ozone layer, then you get more ultraviolet coming to the Earth, and that can cause all kinds of things. You get big sunburns if you're in the wrong place, for example. But it has fluctuated back and forth. There doesn't seem to be a strong correlation between what's been going on with the holes in the ozone, mostly at the South Pole. There's not a good correlation between the fluctuation of the holes in the ozone and climate.
Okay.
Not a good correlation. So we don't think that's really what's driving all the climate.
What do you think is?
I'm convinced that the sun is the principal source of what's going on, and primarily by the mechanism that I mentioned earlier, which is the sun's magnetic field strengthens and weakens, and when it's weak, we get more particles, more radiation coming from space. That causes an increase in the clouds, and that causes more reflection, and we get cooling. There's excellent correlation among all these factors, because, and the way that I've done to get at it is to look at what happens during a cool period, let's say. And during a cool period, presumably we have more incoming ions, more cloud-producing ions. And so, if that's the case, then if there's increased radiation, how can we measure it? Well, we can measure it because in the upper atmosphere, this radiation produces an isotope of carbon called radiocarbon, or carbon-14, and also produces an isotope. An isotope is just the same as an element, except it has some extra neutrons in it and behaves a little differently. There is an increase in the production of beryllium. Beryllium is an element, and it has an isotope, beryllium-10, that is produced like radiocarbon only in the upper atmosphere by radiation. So if we could measure then the amount of radiocarbon, and the amount of beryllium-10 in ice over past years, we could determine what the radiation looked like then. And what we find is a really excellent correlation between the production of these isotopes, meaning increased radiation due to the weakening of the sun's magnetic field. And so this leads me to think that because of this really excellent correlation between climate and the production of these isotopes in the upper atmosphere, that is the fundamental cause of what's driving climate changes.
So, okay, I was going to ask this later, but I was going to ask you later on about like geoengineering and stuff like that. Is there a way that we can control our Earth's climate? And is that safe to do you think? Because with geoengineering, well, some people say it's not really going on, but supposedly they release, aluminum, barium, and strontium, I think the name is, into the air to reflect the sun's rays and stuff like that. What do you think about all that?
The possibility of humans controlling the Earth's climate is about the same as a flea on an elephant's back trying to tell the elephant where to go. There just is no correlation there. And so during the 1970s, there was a cold period I mentioned between 1950 and 1980. And in the 1970s, there were big fears that the Earth was going to go into another ice age. And so there were attempts made to make plans of what we can do about it. And there were suggestions, well, if we put coal dust on glaciers, that'll absorb more heat and that'll melt the ice so it won't overwhelm us, and all kinds of things like putting sulfur into the atmosphere to change the input of radiation, stuff like that. So the answer is man's impact on global climate is probably minuscule, absolutely minuscule, and there really isn't anything we can do about it except adjust. Okay. There's no way that man is going to control the climate.
So all this stuff is just pretty much crazy of all the different things they're trying to do then?
Yeah, well, you can, and imagine now, in the 1970s, they were talking about putting coal dust on glaciers because it was cooling. Now they're talking about putting stuff in the atmosphere to prevent warming. And the effect is probably, the Earth is a pretty big place. And it would take some tremendous amount of energy in order to change the climate of the Earth globally. And I frankly don't think it can be done. And so all these harebrained schemes about putting stuff in the atmosphere is just crazy.
Have you heard about the cloud seeding? All right, so in Europe, it's France and the UK, I believe. Did you hear about these cloud seeding wedding packages that you can order? Have you
No, I haven't. I don't know about those.
Okay, so it's coming out, I believe, in 2018. If you want to get married over there, obviously this is for people that have a lot of money, but you can hire a geologist, a meteorologist, then they'll put up planes up into the skies, see the clouds with whatever, and then the next day they promise you 100% it will be sunny out. What do you think about that?
Crazy. Absolutely nuts.
Do you think it's a real thing? Like,
no, I don't at all.
Really?
About the only thing you can do with cloud seeding is that if you're trying to break a drought and make it rain, and the humidity, if you get the humidity is fairly high, but not high enough to make it to rain. Sometimes you can drop very small amounts of silver nitrate and things like that. That will cause condensation of the water vapor that's in the air. But it doesn't work well at all. Mm-hmm. I've never heard of any real success with it, and I've never heard of any real success of anything that you seed the air with to make the weather do what you want it to do.
Well, this will lead me to my next question then. So I don't know if it was Vietnam or Korea, but one of the wars, they were talking about that, they could geoengineer basically to make a place rained out if they needed to. So that wasn't true at all? They weren't able to actually succeed in that?
No, I've never heard of any success in that kind of thing.
Okay. All right. So, all right, I want to go on to something else. The Antarctica ice sheet, is it currently melting? What's going on with that?
No.
It isn't?
No, in a word. And let me tell you what the basis of my answer is. The Antarctic ice sheet consists of two very large masses of ice sheet. The biggest one is called the East Antarctic Ice Sheet, and it contains about 95% of the ice in Antarctica. It's about 10 to 15,000 feet thick at its thickest. And then there's the West Antarctic Ice Sheet, which is on the west coast of Antarctica, and it contains only about 5% of the total ice that's in Antarctica. The East Antarctic Ice Sheet is cooling, not warming. And that's the only thing you could melt to get much of any rise in sea level, say. And we can look at the temperature now of what's been going on in the Antarctic in two ways. We can look at the ground temperature measured at the South Pole and at Vostok, which is a Russian polar station, going back to 1955. And so during that period, there has been no warming at all. Period. The Antarctic ice sheet at the South Pole has not warmed since 1955, so it's not melting. It's not. And the average annual temperature in the Antarctic is about 58 degrees below zero, and in the winter it's frequently more than 100 degrees below zero. So, if you're going to melt the Antarctic ice sheet, what would you have to do? Well, first of all, you'd have to raise the temperature from 58 degrees below zero up to the melting point of ice. So you'd have to essentially warm the climate from minus 58 to 32 degrees, which is about 90 degrees, in order to get any ice to melt. So I don't think you're going to raise the temperature in Antarctica by 90 degrees to make it melt. So there's no fear of the Antarctic ice melting. It isn't doing it. The other is what's actually happening down there now, and that is over the whole ice cap, not just in one place at the South Pole. And that can be measured by satellites. And satellites have measured the temperatures in the Antarctic for the past 37 years. And they have found no warming of the major Antarctic ice cap in the past 37 years. So the answer to the question is the Antarctic ice sheet is not warming, it's cooling. Mm-hmm. It's as simple as that.
What about our sea levels? Everybody, they're saying that's why our sea levels are rising because of that. So is that true?
That's absolutely false. Absolutely false. If anything, the sea level has actually dropped just a very, very small amount because it is colder in the Antarctic. It's just the opposite. The ice is not melting. It's getting colder. As it gets colder, it has actually resulted in a very, very tiny decrease in sea level rise. Sea level rises has risen since 1850 at a rate of about 7 inches per century. So that's about 3.5 degrees per 50 years, a rough, lifetime of an adult. So any adult who is at least 50 years old has witnessed 3.5 inches of sea level rise and probably didn't notice it. If you want to deviate from that and say, oh, it's going to be much greater because of melting of ice, the question is, where are you going to get the ice to melt? During the last ice age, there were glaciers that were 10,000 feet thick in Canada, in North America, all the way down to Kentucky and Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and all across all of the continental land masses, especially in the northern hemisphere. And these humongous glaciers covering huge areas, all of Canada, all of northern North America, all of Russia, Siberia, from Europe clear down to from Scandinavia down to England. Those ice masses had huge volumes of ice in them. The temperature changed abruptly at the end of the last ice age, and it warmed as much as 20 degrees in less than 100 years.
Wow.
Which caused what amounts to catastrophic melting of these giant ice caps. The global sea level rise did not rise more than about 3 feet per century during the disappearance of these huge, massive ice sheets. So where are you going to get people who are predicting 20 feet of sea level rise?
Yeah, like on the West Coast. What is it like?
There isn't any ice left.
Yeah, like on the West
gone.
Coast, they're saying 5 to 20 feet or something in the next century. Like, it doesn't make sense then.
So I've looked at tide gauge records from all over the world, and there's a very consistent number that keeps reappearing. That's about 7 inches per century since about 1850. And so during that time, if you draw a curve for that whole time period, it gives you pretty much a straight line at about 7 inches a century. In order to get 3 feet instead of 7 inches, the sea level rise, you'd have to go essentially straight up on a curve, and there's no source for water. Where are you going to get the water to do that? So these predictions of 20 feet are just absurd, because you didn't get more than 3 feet during the melting of these humongous ice sheets by drastic climate warming at the end of the last ice age. So why would you get it now when there's no ice around to melt? It doesn't make sense.
Well, Dr. Easterbrook, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
Okay.
Got something to say? Get in on the conversation at 415-915-2291. That's 415-915-CALL-1.
Still don't have it. Yeah, I do. Okay. Put me back on. Sorry. Welcome back to Conspiracies Against Wellness. We are here with guest Dr. Easterbrook talking about climate change. We do have a call. Caller from area code 514. What's your name and where are you from?
Hi, I'm from Montreal, Canada.
Hello. What's your question for Dr. Easterbrook?
I just wanted to know if global warming isn't happening. How come we're seeing flooding everywhere at this time with rising sea and river waters?
Okay, what you don't want to confuse is weather and climate. Weather is changing all the time. You can get any kind of a record storm or temperature or snowfall or whatever on a short-term basis, measured in days or even a single event. It has nothing to do with climate. That's not climate, that's weather, and it changes all the time. When you talk about climate, you're talking about a longer-term change in the atmospheric conditions. And so, for example, let's look at some of the things that have been suggested as changing. The number of hurricanes is at an all-time low. Until until Harvey hit, it had been something like 12 years before a hurricane had hit the United States. The number of hurricanes and the level of the power of the hurricanes is actually going down, not up. If you look at tornadoes, incidents of tornadoes are a dramatic climate event, or a weather event, I should say, and the number of tornadoes is also has gone down over the past century. And look at the amount of snowfall. 5 of the largest global snowfall years have occurred in about the past 6 years. So the amount of snowfall is actually increasing, not decreasing. It's just the opposite of what you hear on the news media. What they're saying on the news media is not true. If you look at the data, and you can get this data, and see it for yourself, the number of extreme events, hurricanes and tornadoes, so on, is actually decreasing, not increasing.
And something that I'll even admit, why are we thinking this? Because I thought there was more storms too. I felt like there was more tornadoes and everything else. Is it just because we have the ability now to capture all this, with our own cell phones and the internet and stuff? Why are we thinking that there is more things going on?
The reason you're thinking more things are happening in terms of extreme events is because of the news media. Every time, look at Harvey, for example, the hurricane. There are all kinds of claims that this is caused by global warming. Well, there hasn't been any warming in the past 20 years, so how could it be due to global warming? It's nuts. And so the truth is that the total number of extreme events of any of these kinds has been diminishing steadily over the past century. It's not getting more frequent, it's getting less frequent. What's happening is the news media is claiming that every time there's a storm, it's caused by global warming. And so the public is being constantly bombarded by the news media with the idea that, all these extreme storms are a bit more frequent. And they're not. The data proves that they are not. But that's not what you'll hear on the news.
Well, and thank you for your call, caller. Something I want to just bring up, too, is I remember in the late 80s, early 90s, I lived in the northeast of the United States. And I remember we would get, especially in March, February and stuff, huge blizzards. And that doesn't go on anymore. And I think because it doesn't, people are like, this is climate change. It's getting warmer. But from what you're saying, really, this is just almost... It just happens, right? So this is a natural thing that we go through of different time periods. Is that
That's right. Yeah. Right. As I pointed out, there have been fluctuations of warm, cool periods throughout the past century. There have been 3 cold periods and 3 warm periods over about the past 100 and some years, something like that. So it is true that during a cold period, you get more frequent storms, snow, and that sort of thing, and that during warm periods you may get some other changes that occurred. But the bottom line is, because it's a cyclic thing, it's warm and cold, warm and cold, warm and cold, there's no net change, and the overall trend is down, not up.
Mm. So what do you think about Al Gore's opinion that we are in the middle of this global warming period, and if we don't change something, SPA, something catastrophic will happen, and that's already occurring on this earth? Is this all a hoax? Why would he come out and write a book like this and win this Nobel Prize and everything?
First of all, the Nobel Prize he won was not a prize in science. It was a political prize. It's a peace prize, which is totally political. Doesn't even come from Sweden, where the other ones come from. And so I don't consider him to be a legitimate Nobel Prize winner as if he's some kind of great scientist. That's not the case. So what he has said is that the Earth's climate has not changed over thousands of years until we get to 1950, when CO2 started to go into the atmosphere, and then that caused the climate to warm. That's his basic. That's what he says in his book. And that is based on what's called a hockey stick curve, which was made by a person in the East and at Penn State, who said the same thing. He said that, on the basis of some tree rings, climate has not changed over many years until we get to 1950, and then it got warmer. Well, the climate data, both historic, measured, all kinds of other things that can be used to measure temperature, shows that is absolutely not true. It was warmer during the medieval warm period from 900 AD to 1300 AD than it is now. It was warmer than today by 2 to 5 degrees in Greenland from 10,000 years to 1,500 years ago. Almost all of the last 10,000 years has been warmer than it is today. So what this means is that there's a huge gulf between the actual data and what Al Gore is claiming. And one of the dumbest things he ever did was, as you've seen the movie, he shows the ice ages temperature going up and down, and then he shows carbon dioxide going up and down. And he says because carbon dioxide now is much higher than it was during the interglacial periods of the past
right, and it wasn't around.
Years. Yeah, but what he fails to tell you is that in those periods where he's showing it, the carbon dioxide always follows the temperature increase. Mm-hmm. So it's a total hoax.
Yeah. We have a call again. Caller from area code 916. What's your name and where are you from?
Austin Bennett, Sacramento, California.
Hi, Mr. Bennett. How are you today?
Oh, I'm fine. Thank you, Janelle. How are you?
Good, thanks. What's your question for Dr. Easterbrook?
Dr. Easterbrook, I appreciate everything you've been sharing, and it's been so informative. And, the question I have is, with the information that you're sharing, and I think that you realize it also, is that, unfortunately, most people aren't going to take time to even understand what you're sharing. And, when you look at the majority of the people, and on top of that, we have a mainstream media that misrepresents facts. So, this is an uphill battle. And what would you suggest to, a lay person like myself in conveying this information? Is there a version that you share with somebody who might not understand the kind of like the the scientific aspect and the explanation? It does take time, but just in a very short version. I mean, what would you say to someone who explaining a situation, let's just say like a sixth grader, explaining that there is no such thing as really as global warming?
Well, it's an uphill battle to fight the news media and to fight the UN forces, which have a lot of power and a lot of money behind them, and so when someone says, "Gee, we're all going to perish because of cataclysmic global warming," and I would say, "Show me the evidence for that. What are you basing that opinion on?" Opinions don't mean anything. You have to. Data speaks far louder than. But I agree with your point that how do you educate the masses of people who are not scientists that the scientific evidence shows that the whole thing is a gigantic hoax, and it's sort of taking care of itself. It's strangely enough. There was a poll recently, and it was a global poll of more than 5 million people. And they asked them to list the 15 biggest problems that the Earth was facing, and guess which was dead last by a long ways, was climate change. People aren't worrying about it, and so it's kind of ironic that most people don't understand climate change. There's no reason why they should if they're not scientists, but yet they don't really care about it because it's not affecting their lives. They can't see that climate is going to be more important than whether or not they have a job or many of the other things that are going on. So it's almost the whole climate scare is sort of failing because people can't experience it in their daily lives and they don't care.
Right. Even you pointed to, I mean, the whole idea with geoengineering somehow deflecting the lunacy in that explanation, but yet often the populace believes it. I used to work as a reporter for an NBC affiliate, and I don't anymore, just because of what you're recognizing, that there is a lot of misrepresentation of truth. But even as a news reporter, and this is why I knew I qualified, you only had to report basically at fourth grade level. As far as what people are going to understand. And so, I really appreciate. The other question I have is, standing for truth, as you're doing, as Janelle does, there is a risk that goes with that. And I don't know if it's really a question. I do want to commend you for what you're doing. But do you see it really, as being someone who is really speaking the truth and that actually doesn't align with the UN agenda, with Agenda 21, and really towards this push for a global government.
New World Order. Mm-hmm.
Do you think much about that? I mean, in terms of if I can, I'm going to share more about myself. See, I stand with you in so much of what you say, and standing for the truth and reporting the truth, and really to save the future for our children. Are you concerned at all about your safety? I mean, I even hate to ask it, just the whole idea that anyone's life would be at risk for speaking the truth. But does that cross your mind at all, just in reporting the truth as you do?
Well, what I have experienced from the start of all this big thing, which goes back now probably 20 years or more, is that the people who are pushing for this global agenda and who are pushing the whole global warming hoax are using what's called argumentum ad hominem, and that means that they don't have the data to counter your arguments, my arguments, let's say.
Right.
So they will not appear in a debate. Mm-hmm. They will not appear, and so therefore, what they do is they say, well, we won't appear in a debate because that would lend credence to this crazy idea that these nutcases have, these climate deniers have, who are really stupid and don't know anything, and therefore we're not going to talk to them, and we don't need to present any evidence or anything like that. And so I take a lot of verbal abuse, is what I'm saying. People who insult me personally, people who say bad things about me and what my views are. And my views really are nothing more than a conveyance of data. I'm not trying to push anything. I just put the data out there and say, look, you judge for yourself. Anybody can see this sort of thing. So the answer to the question is all of us who are so-called skeptics take a lot of verbal abuse needlessly, if it is absolutely non-scientific, means absolutely nothing in terms of science. So somewhere along the line, it's up to an individual to decide whether they want to stand up for truth and what's right or not, or just shut up and go along with the other lemmings. And my nature is that I'm willing to stand up for truth and say it. And people can look at the evidence and the data and judge for themselves.
Right, and you have evidence and data, actually. Oh, so okay. Sorry, go ahead, Austin.
Oh, thanks, Janelle. Just one last comment. Just as a father of five, my youngest being 10, I just want to thank you, Doctor, for standing for the truth. You're a great reflection of a true American, and really what America stood for. So I hope that we'll have another generation to raise up to be men and women who are courageous and intelligent as you. Thank you again.
Well, thank you very much for the compliment.
Yeah, thank you, Austin, for coming on. And by the way, I'm going to just say this quickly. Austin's running 2018's California State Senate District 6 against Senator Pan. Go out and vote for him if you're in that area. Just had to say it. Thanks for calling in, Austin.
Thank you, Jenna. I wasn't going to plug myself, but thank you.
Well, I am.
See you later.
All right, have a good night.
Thank you.
So you were just talking about evidence and data, and evidence is how you predict what climate cycles the Earth will go through. When you were at Washington State Senate Committee on Climate Change, you mentioned that NOAA and NASA manipulated the temperatures on Earth's temperature charts. Can you go into this a little bit in more detail? Like, how did you figure out that they were doing this?
NOAA and NASA used to be very highly respected scientific agencies that put out good data. And NASA still does, except for their climate division, which puts out absolutely fraudulent data. And NOAA, the same thing. NOAA has an oceanographic branch, which is absolutely excellent, but their climate branch is run by people who are pushing the global warming hoax, and they do this by changing the data. There are weather stations all over the world that collect daily temperature records, rainfall records, and so on. And these are collected and put into a big database. And then there are global curves that are put out, and local curves of temperature changes for the United States, for example, and then also for the rest of the world. And those are based on measurements of actual temperature, air temperature, with thermometers or various temperature recording devices. And so that's the basic data. And what has happened is that this data that's collected by both NOAA and by NASA is then manipulated, and they change the data. And for example, you probably aren't aware of this, but about 50% of the data which is reported by NOAA and NASA in claiming their unprecedented warming does not exist. The data does not exist. It's fabricated by a model. And so the way they do this is, let's say we put a thermometer down on the table in front of you and it measures 70 degrees. And so that's a temperature that you record. Well, what NOAA and NASA would do with that kind of data is they would say, okay, we're going to look at the temperature 100 miles in this direction and 50 miles in that direction all around. And then we're going to put it in a model and see what the model says the temperature should be there based on this more regional approach. And so the data that's finally recorded is not actual data that's been measured. It's been manufactured by a model, by a computer model. And strangely enough, what they have done is the hottest decade in the past century were the 1930s, no doubt about it. It was warmer in the 1930s than it has been, say, since the year 2000. But now they're claiming that the last 10 years have been the hottest decade ever. How did they do that? Well, if you take the original data and plot it, the 1930s were the hottest decade, hotter than now. And so what they've done is they've subtracted as much as 1 or 2 degrees, which is huge, from those 1930 temperatures and dropped them below the level of the temperatures that are being recorded now. And they make up sort of paltry excuses like, oh, well, this is data homogenization, and they have terms for it and that sort of thing. But it's always in terms of making the past cooler and the present warmer. And so they have manipulated, they've tampered with the data to make it look like something. They have turned cooling trends into warming trends by doing this kind of thing.
When did you notice that?
And it's absolutely fraudulent.
Yeah.
The kinds of things that they're putting out, the kinds of things they're saying. Because the one thing they can't change is recordings of the maximum temperature. At a weather station, they record the temperature periodically and record the maximum temperature during a 24-hour period and the minimum. If you look at the maximum temperatures, say in the U.S. at good reporting stations, it is there are many days, for example, that were over 100 degrees in various parts of the United States than at the present time. And so it's very clear that it was a lot hotter in the 1930s, especially 1936 and 1934, than the present time. But they have changed those warm days that occurred back then into cooler days, and they've changed the trend from a cooling trend into a warming trend by tampering with the data. That's what they do.
So when did you notice these changes? I mean, like was it, how did you figure this out?
Okay, I didn't figure it out myself. The guy who figured this out is a guy whose name is Tony Heller, and he has a website called Real Science, and you can find all the data. You can find these curves, and just look up Tony Heller online, and you can see the data for yourself because he has gone back and gone through all of the records and plotted what the original data was in the 1930s, let's say, and how it's gone down. And he has shown that NASA, for example, changed the actual temperatures that it itself had reported at several times during the last 10 years. So if you look at their data from 10 years ago and look at it now, it's hotter now than it was then, or if it's in the 1930s, they have cooled it off. they've changed the data several times in the last 10 years. So they are not reporting good data. I would say that the only data you can really believe these days is not NOAA data and not NASA data. It's the satellite data from 2 satellites, which is confirmed by weather balloons. That's the only data you can really believe these days.
Okay. So I also noticed when I was going through all your stuff, people are suggesting our oceans are acid. Can you talk about this? Do you believe that ocean acidification exists today here in the Northwest?
That's an interesting question, because the name itself is a misnomer, because acidification means to turn something into an acid, and the oceans are alkaline. They're not acid. The average pH, the average measure of the acidity of the oceans, is about 8.2. 7.0 is neutral, and below that is acid. So in order for the oceans to be acid, they would have to have a pH of less than 7, and it's 8.2. It's alkaline. So there's a misnomer to start with. And so you could say, well, are the oceans becoming less alkaline then? And the answer is that not really. There's a lot of variability. There's more variability in a single site than there is in the global variability with time. And there isn't really a good picture of what the acidity, what the pH of the oceans is on any kind of a systematic scale. You know, they're not devices that measure the acidity every so many miles over the ocean. And so the answer to that question is the oceans, A, are not becoming, there's no such thing as ocean acidification. And so the basic idea behind this is that, gosh, we've got global warming, and that's changing the amount of CO2 that is in the oceans, and that's changing the pH, the measure of how acid water is. And the whole idea is that because they claim that global warming is causing this, that the oceans are becoming less alkaline, if you like. So what I'm saying is that they're claiming that CO2 in the atmosphere is causing a change in the pH of the oceans, the measure of how acid it is. And if you look at the possibility, you think, okay, but we can determine absolutely there's been no global warming in the past 20 years. So how could that be causing the oceans to become less alkaline? You know, it's stupid. And so we could then take a look at, okay, how much has the CO2 in the atmosphere changed? You can't ascribe any climate change to CO2 before about 1950, because this is when the human emissions started to soar like crazy, and the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere went from about 300 to about 400 parts per million. So with that period to work with, we can ask the question, how much has the content of CO2 in the atmosphere changed since 1950? And it's changed by 8/1000ths of 1%, which is about as close to zero as you can get.
Yeah.
And there are about 300 million cubic miles of ocean water. So how could the change in CO2 of 8/1000ths of 1% change the acidity of 300 million cubic miles of ocean water? It's dumb.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, it's just that's what it is. Are other scientists and geologists around the world standing up against this majority on this topic, like of what the media is putting out and what other, I don't know, what? Because you have to understand, the average person is only really hearing what the media is saying. I research more because of what I do. And you, obviously, you're doing what you do. But are there other scientists and geologists and stuff that are coming together to talk about this so people, the average person, does know more about this? And they can't be taken over by the media and everybody else.
Well, there are a couple of issues here. One is, what does the majority of scientists think about climate change, global warming, and so on? And what you will hear over and over and over again, I hear it several times a day almost, is that 90% of all scientists in the world believe that catastrophic global warming is around the corner.
Right.
Well, then you look at where does that come from? That number first came from a study by a graduate student in Indiana or Illinois, I'm not sure which, in which the person sent, I think it was a woman, sent out questionnaires to about 10,000 people, presumably scientists, and got back about 3,500 responses. And they then selected 79 out of those 3,500 to look at, and they decided that 77 of those 79 selected ones, specially selected ones, said that yes, that's true, CO2 is going to cause catastrophic global warming. Well,
wow.
77 divided by 79 is 97%. That's not all the scientists in the world. That's a hand-picked 79 individuals out of 3,000 in a survey. And if you look at the whole survey, 77 out of 3,500, it's only a couple of percent, something like that. Right. So that's a total hoax. The second one was based on a survey of articles that have been published in journals that relate to climate, and they claimed that 97% of the published articles about climate agreed that CO2 was going to cause catastrophic global warming. Well, somebody went back and recounted those same 10,000 journals or whatever it was, and they got 2%, not 97%. So that whole claim of 90% is totally false. There was a good article in at least one of the newspapers, the New York newspapers, about that, but it hasn't gained a lot of traction because I still hear it every day. And as soon as you hear somebody say 97% of all scientists agree, you know that they are either uninformed or stupid, one of the two, or maybe both, for that matter. So the other thing is that, okay, how many scientists in the U.S. Are skeptical of this whole thing? There is online, where you can see it, anybody can see it who wants to call it up, a registry of 32,000 American scientists, defined as someone who has a degree in one of the sciences, who have signed a statement that says, we do not believe that CO2 has an appreciable effect on the Earth's atmosphere, and especially on global temperature. So there are 32,000 people who are skeptics, and you never hear that number. All you hear is this 97% thing. So we have 32,000. Now, if the 97% thing were true, there would need to be 1 million scientists who believe in CO2 causing global warming, if 32,000 is only 3%.
Right.
So that whole thing, and then to make it even clearer, consensus doesn't mean anything. The number of scientists who believe something is totally irrelevant. Doesn't matter. One of my favorite stories is by Einstein, who, when he published his theory of relativity, caused a great stir in the physics world. And so there was a committee of 100 of the world's most notable scientists who were assigned the task of trying to prove that Einstein was wrong. And when asked about that, he was asked, well, how do you feel about these 100 scientists who are trying to prove you wrong? And his response was, I don't know why they need 100. It only takes one to prove me wrong. Just like Galileo and the flat Earth. So consensus doesn't mean anything. Even if it were true, and it's not, it wouldn't mean anything.
Right. How do you think we can change this point of view? Because this is the thing. I understand what you're saying here. Okay, like you're a geologist, and that most geologists don't think this way. But then you have the media, and if you could get people to back the media and everything else, or support the government or whatever and what they want to do, then they're going to push their agendas through. So how do we change this? Do you have any ideas on that?
The way you change it is essentially by not funding the hoax. And that's going on right now. The withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, for example,
Yes.
which called for the U.S. spending billions of dollars on this whole useless idea, which is going to go in the pockets of various people in the UN and other people who are pushing the whole global warming kind of thing. And so the question then that you're asking is essentially, how do you get the everyday person on the street to understand this? And the answer, I think, is you probably can't, because of the huge influence of the news media. They bombard the public every day with this nonsense about the warmest year ever, and this storm proves that we're all going to turn to toast. Totally indifferent to the actual facts and data. But as I pointed out earlier, it's almost impossible it would be impossible to get the news media to change their attitude. They're not listening to reason at all. They don't care because they have a different agenda. And so how do you educate the public? And I think the answer is people like me who speak out, and it start people wondering, well, gosh, maybe we're not getting the whole story. But in terms of the total population of large numbers of people who really have no way of telling who is right and who is wrong, I think the bottom line is going to be indifference. And that is, curiously enough, they don't particularly understand what's going on, but they don't care. And so, because it doesn't really affect their everyday life, what difference does it make today whether or not global warming is real or not?
Right.
Well, I haven't noticed any difference in the past few years about anything going. Nothing is going on that affects their lives directly as other issues. And that's why in any kind of a poll, climate change concerns are always dead last. People don't care. They have a lot more other things that they are more concerned about than climate change. So I think the answer to your question is it's probably just going to die of atrophy. People don't care.
Yeah, well, and eventually, too. I mean, when whatever doesn't happen when they said it would, I mean, people are going to kind of figure it out and scratch their heads there. So,
well, they've lost a lot of credibility when they were predicting that parts of New York, some streets are going to be underwater by 2010.
Yep.
And the Arctic was going to be ice-free by 2000 and something or other, and none of that happened.
Right.
So some of that's been long enough ago, so their predictions are not happening.
Well, even the silly thing of the Y2K thing back in 2000, 1999. I mean, there's just a million of them, but, when it passes, I remember that point, my grandparents were buying generators and stuff, and I was young, and I'm looking at them like, what are you doing? It's going to be able to go to 2000, don't worry. No, but it's just these are the crazy things that are thought up, and you're right. I think we do buy into them. I buy into some of them, I do. And before I started doing all this stuff, I had no clue. I really didn't, and I went along and I believed the media, and I think that's just important. Why it's so important that we do research, we dig a little deeper, because if you do dig just even a little deeper, you're gonna start finding stuff there. I mean, maybe just stop watching national media or something like that. I don't know.
I think the national media has zero credibility when it comes to real science. They're just they are not at all telling the truth, and they have an agenda, and as long as it suits their agenda, that's what they do, and they don't really care what the facts are.
Right. Well, even look at all of the commercials for the vaccines and medications and stuff like that. Pharma's in their pocket right there. I mean, I think they get a few $1 billion a year to put that stuff out there. So of course they're going to put that stuff up. Of course they're not going to talk about anything on there. And you're right, science. Heck no. I think it's funny every year in the wintertime. Now they have the polar vortex. They have all these other names, and it's just oh my gosh, it's the polar vortex. What is that?
Going on forever.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we get going here tonight?
Well, I think that probably to sum it all up is that the whole global warming thing that's going on now is all about money and power. It's about changing the world government, and it's using up trillions of dollars every year. And there has been a big change now that we've pulled out of Paris, and we've rescinded funding of the UN climate agency, that sort of thing, and that will help because the people who are in it for the money or the power are never going to quit. They're going to just keep on going no matter what, and so it makes a big difference to remove the funding. That will go a long ways, especially in the UN and in these climate conferences. So I think that the bottom line here is keep telling the truth, and when the predictions fail to come true, and when global warming doesn't happen, as it hasn't for 20 years, when there's been no global warming in 40 years, it'll die its own natural death. In the end, Mother Nature will be the judge and will tell us what is really going on.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Easterbrook, thank you so much for coming on to Conspiracies Against Wellness. I've definitely learned new information on the subject of climate change that you've shared with us this evening. Again, thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome. It's been fun chatting with you.
Absolutely. Tomorrow evening, we will dive into this subject even further. Please call in with any comments or questions you may have from what you've learned tonight. I'm Janelle Elgoy, and have a good night and good evening, Con Nation.
Listening to Conspiracies Against Wellness with Janelle Elgoway. Join us tomorrow at 8 p.m. Eastern to get in on the conversation. The opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and callers, and not necessarily those of EXG LLC, its employees or sponsors. I'm David Schick.
Copyright 2017 by EXG LLC. All rights reserved.